integrated assessment?
Integrated assessment's a term that has been used almost as an umbrella term to talk about a number of kinds of test tasks or assessments. It basically is when a test combines two or more skills. It could be things like reading with writing or reading, listening, and speaking. Generally, integrated assessment leads towards productive skills. So it's a performance kind of assessment. Maybe you have to speak or write, and it's on the same topic of something that you've been reading and listening to. So there's a sort of interaction through the process of the task. Often you'll find integrated assessment in tests of language for specific purposes or for academic purposes, because in developing those tests, if you go out and do a needs analysis, we often find that in academic setting, people need to use language skills in an integrated, overlapping way. The performance that's part of this integrated assessment can vary a good deal. So there are some which require summarizing. You read something and then you summarize it. There are others that might be reading a couple of things or listening and reading to things and then writing your own opinion but using the other sources as support. Those kinds would be called content responsible writing. Speaking as well could appear in content responsible forms. And then there are other types where maybe the input is just for stimulus. It's to give ideas on what to talk about or ideas on what to write about. There are also tests which have thematic links, which sometimes are considered integrated. And so the reading part of the test, you'll read something that later on you're going to write about as well. So the topics are thematically linked.
What is the difference between integrated and individual skill testing?
It depends a lot on the tasks, but in some ways you may be measuring something different with an integrated task, particularly if we're talking about the performance type tasks of speaking or writing. In the integrated task, it's perhaps a more complex task that might require multiple steps or a longer process. The task development can be more difficult for integrated tasks. If you think of independent writing prompts, for example, you can write quite a few of those and pilot them and have a number of tasks to choose from or prompts to choose from. But when you're designing an integrated task, there's a lot of development, often an input tests, and then making sure that the performance is something that matches those input tests. So it can be kind of complicated. And lastly, the scoring could be different. It isn't always, but it might if you're doing a content responsible type integrated task. The scoring could ask if the test taker used or summarized the text appropriately or something like that. So they could be quite similar, but they can also be very different.
Methods for integrated assessment.
I don't know if we know yet, but there's some things I could recommend about integrated assessment. One might be that, as with most assessment, collecting multiple measures is important. So perhaps you pair an integrated task with an independent task or several types of integrated tasks. So it's good to collect multiple measures. And I think piloting is also really important with integrated tasks. Because you need to see how the test takers are going to approach the task. They may not be experienced with this kind of test, and so they're not sure what to do with this input they're being given. And so looking at that carefully is important, and also looking at how the raters handle the tasks, because ultimately there will be scores that have to be interpreted, and so it's important to look at that.
In an integrated assessment, what are the inherent challenges?
Well, because it's performance assessment, there's some challenges that are common of performance assessment, like topic effect, the task effects, rater reliability is an issue. I think in some ways there's some things that are exacerbated with integrated assessment. For example, construct definition. In some ways, people feel that integrating skills muddies what you're trying to assess. So if it's a writing test and you've added reading, what is the construct that you're measuring? And so we need to do a lot of work in looking at in integrated tasks, how these skills interact, how they overlap, and how do they support each other. Instructions, I think, are a challenge for integrated assessment, again, because they're not as familiar to test takers. They may not know what to do with the material they're being given to listen to or read. So I think as exposure to integrated tasks increase in tests, this may be less of a problem, but even with good instructions right now, I think it can be a challenge for test takers to know what to do or what's expected. One challenge that's come up with, particularly in assessing for academic purposes, with reading to write tasks, is the test takers might borrow chunks of language or copy from the source text and then include that in their writing without proper quotation mark or citation, and that is a problem for raters, because as they read it, whose writing are they evaluating? And it might be a challenge in instructions, because for test takers, they might think this is an appropriate strategy or an effective strategy, when really it might not be the best way to use the sources. Scoring, I've mentioned before, but scoring is an issue in terms of the raters and also in terms of interpreting the score. So for raters, now they have to deal with a different kind of tasks than maybe an independent task. And they may have to consider the source material or the input in part of the rating. So I think it's actually a good idea to have raters take the tasks, even though it gives them a little more work. That's, I think, the best way for them to go through and think about what this means for the test takers to have this input and to write or to speak as a result. In interpreting the scores, you have to think about how are the skills represented, or the interaction of the skills represented in the rubric. And so maybe developing a rubric specific for the task is important, but also, when you end up with the number or whatever kind of score band you have at the end, is that a reflection of writing? Is that a reflection of reading and writing? Is it the general language proficiency? And so score interpretation is another challenge.
Well, given all the challenges, what are the benefits?
Well, I think there are a number of reasons people are excited about integrated assessment. One might be that it's sort of taking a step away from defining language as these 4 skills. So while I think in theory and in teaching, we do see these skills as overlapping and not totally separated, although sometimes maybe they are separated. Integrated skills is a way to start to bring the 4 skills together. And maybe not necessarily seeing language as a unitary construct, but as perhaps a more complex construct. And that's kind of exciting, I think. Now, another thing that's really, I think, pushed forward integrated assessment, particularly in these specific purposes or academic purposes, testing contexts, is the idea of authenticity, I guess, that when you look at tasks in these contexts, you see that skills are integrated. And so in integrated assessment, there's the idea that we're trying to create a similar type of task, and that will, could be also called a kind of validity, a predictive validity, if you will. What's interesting to think about, and I found in some of my research, is that, in fact, test takers that I've talked to often prefer an integrated skills task over something that's independent. Particularly in performance assessment, which surprised me a little. I thought giving something to read or something to listen to would make it a harder task and they wouldn't like it. But actually I found that giving them that content allows them to generate more ideas. It gives them information to base their writing on. I've had test takers say it makes them feel more confident, because once they read about the topic, they feel like they know a little bit more. And so when they write, they feel more confident. And so those are some reasons that it might be exciting to do integrated tasks. I think in general, including integrated assessment as a way forward, thinking about assessment, it opens up some exciting possibilities. There's a lot to still figure out, but in some ways it gives us some new ways to look and to think about language.